Henri Amiel once wrote, "You want to know the art of living, my friend? It is contained in one phrase: make use of suffering." In his classic work, The City of God, St. Augustine, who's one of the church fathers in the the 4th and 5th centuries, he asked this question: why does suffering come to all people regardless of how good they are? Regardless of how good they are. And he said, part of the reason is that the effect of the suffering can be different. And it is different for different people. And this is how he put it. He said, though the sufferings are the same, the sufferers remain different. The fire which makes gold shine makes chaff smoke. The fire which makes gold shine makes chaff smoke. In part, he's saying to a very large extent, the meaning of our suffering, whether or not it does anything, whether or not it matters, whether or not it makes us into gold or just makes us go up in smoke, has to do with who we were before the suffering and how we made meaning of the suffering as we went through it. And at the same time, the challenge is we are sometimes, if we're honest, pretty afraid to look suffering full in the face, aren't we? And we're afraid to look at the suffering of our world full in the face. We thank God under our breath that we can flip by the suffering as we scroll to something happier and distracting. And we're also afraid to look at our own suffering, our own story, the pain that we hold from our childhood or from our week. Because we're afraid that if we look it full in the face, it'll destroy us. It'll shake us. It'll mess up our worldview, the way that we see the world, that helps us hold it all together, to have a semblance of peace. Because we can understand the world in some way. We're afraid that it'll destroy the meaning that we make of our lives, that in the midst of the uncertainty and the chaos and the struggle. And that what will happen is that if we look at it full in the face, that we will come out thinking that our suffering and the suffering of our world is actually at the end of the day just absurd, just pointless, purposeless, meaningless. And we don't want that for our pain. I want to invite you, if that's you at all this morning, if you resonate with that at all this morning, to be courageous with me for a few minutes and look at our suffering full in the face. In fact, look at our world through the lens of the suffering that we've experienced. I shared a story 2 weeks ago when I preached last of Nick Wolterstorff from his book Lament for a Son, where he lost his son Eric at 25 in a climbing accident. And in his book, he wrote this defiant phrase of hope: I shall look at the world through tears. Perhaps I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see. I shall look at the world through tears. Perhaps I shall see things dry-eyed that I could not see. Our tears can be a lens to see our world more clearly, to see our world actually in focus instead of blurry. And in fact, not only can our suffering be a lens to see the world more truly, but actually the meaning that we make of it can be crucial for us to endure the suffering that we face. It's a symbiotic relationship. The two things go together. Meaning making and suffering. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of several concentration camps during the Holocaust. He described how he noticed during his time in concentration camps that some of the prisoners were able to endure and pass through the horrors of their imprisonment, and others weren't. They just gave up. And he said the difference came down to whether or not they could make meaning of their suffering. Whether or not there seemed to be any purpose to it. And if they perceived that there wasn't any, they said, what would be the point of continuing on? What would be the point? If it doesn't matter, why does it matter? You see, not only can our suffering help us make meaning of our lives in a deeper way, but meaning that we make can also help us endure our suffering. And so today we're going to do a deep dive into this passage from Lamentations 3, where the author does the best he can in the midst of incredible suffering to make meaning of it. And what we're going to see is, first, who makes the meaning? Second, the ingredients we need for making meaning in our suffering. And third, finally, the meaning that we actually can make of it. Who makes it? What ingredients do we need? And what is the meaning that we can make of our suffering? First, who makes the meaning? Nobody wants to learn about suffering from somebody who hasn't suffered. Am I right? Like, there's nothing more annoying than a Kardashian getting up on TikTok and helping, like, prisoners of war learn how to heal. You don't want to learn about suffering from somebody who hasn't gone through it. And in our text today, we see a poet who has been through it. We see a person who has deeply experienced pain and deeply wrestled with the meaning of that pain. This is how he describes his own life. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than in light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He is willing to go to the rawest place of his suffering and say, the Lord has led me here. He goes on to say, he's made my skin and my flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. Have you ever felt trapped in your suffering? Like your life is supposed to be a journey from one place to another, but it just doesn't seem to be going anywhere. He has besieged me and surrounded me. He has made me stay in darkness, like a dead person walking. He's walled me in so I cannot escape. His life seems stable in the worst way. He's not going anywhere. And God can't even seem to hear him from the other side of the wall that he's built. He shuts out his prayers. When he says he's barred my way with blocks of stone, that word blocks of stone, it actually means a stone that's not just like any rock, but a stone specifically chiseled and shaped to fit neatly and tightly in a wall so that the wall would be solid and immovable. Like a bear lying in wait, He dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. The poet here has been hunted. He has been pounced on. He's been attacked. He's been mauled, pierced, left for dead, and mocked. Instead of water, he's been given gall, a vinegary, nasty drink. The narrator here the poet is identifying himself with the suffering of Zion. As we talked about it for the last couple weeks, Lamentations is written in the context of not just one person's suffering, but the suffering of the whole community. I don't know if anybody in Oakland can resonate with this right now. But it's written in the context of the siege of Jerusalem that ended in horrible suffering, famine, destruction, and exile. And the poet here is saying, my whole life has been a siege. I personally have experienced this with you. This is not the professor telling you how to make meaning of your suffering. This is not the philosopher. This is not the abstract teacher. This is the mother at her child's funeral. This is the bereaved husband eulogizing his wife. And when someone stands in that moment, in that level of grief, and says, though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. You got to listen to someone who can say that in that moment. Gerald Sitzer is a man just like that. 20 years ago, he lost his daughter, his wife, and his mother in a single tragic car accident. And he writes about it in a book called A Grace Disguised. And in it he says, I did not go through pain and come out the other side. Instead, I lived in it and found within that pain the grace to survive and eventually grow. People who have been there, whether it's the poet of Lamentations, whether it's Gerald Sitzer, whether it's someone in your own life, a parent, an elder, yourself, people who have been there tell us there's meaning there. It's not for nothing. It doesn't not matter. So let's look at the ingredients that this poet needs to make meaning of it. Because they're a little bit different than the ingredients that we often get in our world. The poet here, you might be forgiven for thinking that the poet is dealing with the problem of what philosophers, theologians call theodicy, which is basically this problem of how can God be good and powerful and this still happen to me? How can God be good and powerful and evil still exist in the world? That is not actually the problem that the poet is dealing with. He doesn't seem to have that problem. In fact, he takes it for granted that God does exist, is powerful enough to do something, is good, and was involved. He holds all of that together. The ingredients that he seems to need in order to believe all of that and hold all of that in tension are basically three. God is big, God is mysterious, and God is love. God is big, God is mysterious, and God is love. Listen, many people in our world today, maybe even some of us, if we're honest, don't really believe in a very big God. We tend to believe in a God who is us-sized. In other words, a God whose primary purpose is to make me happy, to make me feel fulfilled, actualized, to make my life good. And therefore, it is really difficult to deal with the possibility that such a God exists in the face of our suffering. Because if the God of our world is a powerful, amorphous force of loving kindness that exists primarily to make us happy, then what happens when we're not? I mean, it's the essence of suffering that we are not happy in it. The author of Lamentations has faith in a God that is too big not to be involved in his suffering. And that's why he's angry. That's why he's confused. That's why he's crying out, because his God is what he calls the Most High in verses 35 and 38. He is the Most High. He is the universal, one powerful God of the universe. How is this happening? He is the creator of the universe. I read somewhere recently that the radius of the earth is about 4,000 miles. So from the center point of the ball to the outer edge, to where we're standing, is about 4,000 miles. God made all of that, the Bible says. And then I read somewhere else, and Meredith, correct me if I'm wrong, but the size of the observable universe is this. I don't know what that number is, but it's big. It's 3 with 27 zeros. That means that the observable universe is at least 750 sextillion times the size of the earth. Yes, I said sextillion in church. I don't know what it means, but it's a lot. It's so many times. Do you think that a God who is that big, who created all of that, exists to make me feel good? That's his primary function? Friends, our God existed before I existed. Before any of this ever existed, he was fine. He created this world because he wanted to, not because he needed to. He doesn't exist for me. I exist for him. A thin belief in God, I would argue, is actually a worse pre-existing condition for suffering than no belief in God. Because if you believe in a God whose primary function is to make you happy, then all suffering can do is to throw you into despair. All suffering can do is to ruin your worldview. All suffering can do is to prove God's absence. In other words, true suffering renders our lives meaningless to the degree that our lives are just about being happier. Because suffering destroys happiness. Unless, of course, and this is where somebody might push back, well, what if your suffering now is leveraged somehow into greater happiness later on, into growth? Isn't there meaning and purpose in that? Oh, there is, sure, there can be. But I would counter, there are some types of suffering that just can't be. And I know some of you in this room have experienced that. In his book, How to Know a Person, David Brooks, he tells this story of Rabbi Harold Kushner, whose son Aaron died of a rare aging disease. at 14 years old. And he says Rabbi Kushner spent the year reflecting on how the tragedy had shaped him and studying how other people are remade by their sufferings. He said, I'm a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I would have been without him. And I would give up all those gains in a second if I could have my son back. If I could choose, I would forego all the spiritual growth and depth which has come my way because of those experiences. But I cannot choose. There are some types of suffering that cannot be leveraged into greater happiness later on. And if our God is thin, small, so that his main purpose is our individual happiness, then no amount of personal growth can make our deepest pains meaningful. If we're really honest. But the God of Lamentations is a big God. He is a big God, which means at the very least that his purposes, his intentions, and his methods are also way beyond our human understanding. His bigness entails his mystery. He is what theologians call inscrutable, unfigureoutable, incomprehensible. He is a mysterious God. I mentioned Viktor Frankl before, who survived the concentration camps. He was a psychotherapist before the Holocaust and also after. And he spoke with different people, many people who'd gone through trauma, gone through suffering. And he spoke with groups of people who had gone through really horrible things. And this time he said, he addressed himself to the whole group. And he said, the question that I asked them was whether an ape, which is being used to develop poliomyelitis serum, basically a vaccine for polio. He said, he asked them whether this ape that was being used to develop this vaccine, and for this reason was being punctured again and again and again, would ever be able to grasp the meaning of his suffering. And unanimously, the group replied that, of course, the ape would not. With its limited intelligence, it could not enter the world of man. That is the only world in which the meaning of his suffering would be understandable. Then I pushed forward with the following question, he said. And what about man? What about human beings? Are you so sure that the human world is the terminal point of the evolution of the cosmos? In other words, are you so sure that the meaning that we can make as human beings is the highest level there is? Is it not conceivable that there is still another dimension, a world beyond man's world, a world in which the question of ultimate meaning of human suffering would find an answer? Saying the ape wouldn't know about our level of meaning. How would we know about the next level if it did exist? The poet of Lamentations, it has the same sort of reasoning that Viktor Frankl does. It says that if humans are on another wavelength from animals in terms of being able to make meaning of our suffering, maybe there's someone who is on another wavelength from us. Maybe there is a level, maybe there is a universe, maybe there is a place in which there is meaning made of our suffering that we don't have access to. The poet's belief in God's mystery and the fact that God's purposes and plans and thoughts are way too mysterious for us, it creates room in him for waiting. For waiting. A fundamental ingredient for making meaning. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence. For the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Do you hear how he's not 100% sure in that moment when he writes that. There may yet, maybe, perhaps, be hope. But in the waiting, he finds something else about God. He finds that God is not only big, God is not only mysterious, but that God is love. How could he possibly see this in the midst of all of the suffering he just detailed for us? He's above ground breathing. His evidence in the poem is his survival. Because of the Lord's great love, he says, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Who in here knows that every day you wake up is a gift from God? Who in here knows that every day you lift your head from the pillow is evidence that God's compassions never fail? If a doctor hadn't ordered a particular test, my chemo wouldn't have come until too late. If a doctor hadn't seen a particular thing and decided to run another test, my chemo wouldn't have come until too late. If I had decided to pull the car out 1 second earlier, I would have been a tragic news story. If a man with 3 teardrop tattoos on his face hadn't have stepped up for me last week at a gas station, I might have had some bullets in me. But because of the Lord's great love, I am not consumed. Because of the Lord's great love, you are not consumed. The fire may be raging all around you, but as we sang earlier this morning, he's been the fourth man in the fire the whole time. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. And every time I lift my head off of the pillow, I do it because God is love. If you have ever been praying for protection, for survival, you have a reason to thank God today. If you have ever prayed that for your kids, and they're here with you today, you have a reason to thank God today. Where there is life, there is hope. One pastor that I follow on Instagram, he recently posted the words of this popular worship song. If you're not dead, God's not done. To which I say, amen. And I think we need to go a little bit deeper than that. Because we have something that Lamentations doesn't have. We have perspective that that the poet did not have. We have evidence of God's bigness, God's mystery, God's unfailing love that the poet of Lamentations did not see. And that is, we have the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And this is where Christians make ultimate meaning of our suffering. Our suffering is not only meaningful if we can leverage it to be happier later in life. If you want indispensable resources to make meaning of your suffering, if you want unassailable evidence that your suffering matters, that it is not meaningless, you have it in the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. Tim Keller, in his incredible book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, he writes this. He says, according to Christian theology, suffering is not meaningless, neither in general nor in particular instances. For God has purposed to defeat evil so exhaustively on the cross that all of the ravages of evil will someday be undone, and we, despite participating in it so deeply, will be saved. God is accomplishing this, hear this part, not in spite of suffering, agony, and loss, but through it. It is through the suffering of God that the suffering of humankind will eventually be overcome and undone. God, in his own mysterious ways, is not accomplishing his purposes despite suffering. And we don't know why he doesn't just snap his fingers and call it a day. We don't know. But what we do know is he doesn't do it arbitrarily, because he himself was willing to suffer in a way that we never were, in a way that we never have and never will. We know that our God was willing to suffer. And so we know that he does not allow us to suffer arbitrarily. That, as the psalmist says, though he brings grief, he will bring compassion. It is not his will for us to suffer. Our suffering matters because God works through it, not despite it. And you might be wondering, well, okay then, but what if something is accomplished, or what if something is accomplished by our suffering? What if? What if something is even accomplished by our death? You know, somebody got shot a few weeks ago, right over here, saving their boss from a robbery, accomplishing something. But he's not around to enjoy that. What if something good comes from our suffering, but we're not here to enjoy it? And if eventually no one is here around to enjoy it because we're told that our earth is going to get swallowed up in a supernova or a black hole or something anyway, eventually, what good is our suffering if it accomplishes something that gets wiped out by death in the end? In other words, what if my pastor's friend's meme is actually right? And that is the mere truth of it. If you're not dead, God's not done. But if you are, he is. We need more than that. We need a deeper reason to hope than our own survival. We need a deeper hope than this life. We need life beyond life. We need life beyond death. And Jesus of Nazareth gives us just such a hope in his resurrection. You see, Jesus had been mauled by the religious leaders. He had been hunted by them into the Garden of Gethsemane. He had been pierced by the nails and the spears of the Roman soldiers. He literally drank gall like the poet, the vinegar on a sponge on a stick, while he was on the cross asking for water because he thirsted. He was mocked and he was spit on by onlookers. He went down to the grave and was like one of those long dead. He even had a stone chiseled to cover him up and to keep him there, to block his exit from the grave. But a day went by, and then another, and on the third day, our Lord got up. On the third day, he took off those grave clothes, he rolled the stone away, and he walked out of the grave, out of the darkness, into the light, out of death, into life. And check this out. With that glorified body that somehow could roll this heavy stone fit for a tomb away, that could somehow walk through walls into where his disciples were meeting in a locked room. In that glorified body, you know what still existed? His wounds. Thomas could put his hands in Jesus' pierced hands and his hand into his side. The wounds of his suffering remained and were glorified in his glorified resurrected body. And that is a testimony to what God will do with you, with me, with our whole world. We don't know how, because God is mysterious. We don't know how it's possible, but God is big. But we know that God is love, and if he did it with Jesus, he will do it with us. Our wounds will be glorified in the resurrection of the dead. That is our hope. Henry Nouwen, an author and priest, he wrote this book a while back. Well, actually, he wrote a letter to his father a few weeks after his mother's death. And it became a book later on called A Letter of Consolation. And in it, he wrote this to his father about the resurrection. Doesn't this turn everything around and offer us a basis on which we can live with hope? Doesn't this put Mother's death in a completely new perspective? It doesn't make her death less painful or our grief less heavy. It does not make the loss of her less real, but it makes us see and feel that death is part of a much greater and a much deeper event, the fullness of which we cannot comprehend, but of which we know that it is a life-bringing event. In 1871, Horatio Spafford was financially ruined. He was a wealthy person who had bought up a bunch of land in Chicago, and in the Great Fire of 1871, his property was completely destroyed. He was all but completely ruined. And then in 1873, there was an economic downturn, and what little he had left in the bank account was wiped out. And he was dealing with all kinds of issues with the city, trying to recoup something for him and his family, trying to figure out zoning issues with this property that maybe he would be able to scrape some ends meeting together. I don't know if that's a word. But Horatio Spafford, because he was working, trying to make do in this horrible financial circumstance, decided not to go right away with his wife and his 4 daughters to England, where they were looking to participate in a revival. So he sent them ahead across the Atlantic on a steamship. And a few weeks later, he got a letter from his wife, Anna, that just said, "Saved alone." Because that steamship had been struck by another ship and sank too quickly for almost anyone to be saved, and all 4 of his daughters died. So immediately he got on a boat and he sailed to England to grieve with his wife. And while he was passing the area where his daughter's boat sank, he wrote these words.
Peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my Lord, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
And his peace that he describes in the song wasn't just a stiff upper lip. He wasn't just muscling through. His peace was an abiding hope that one day Jesus, who rose from the dead, would return, and his daughters and him and his wife would all be raised in a glorious new earth.
But Lord, 'tis for thee, for thy coming we wait. The sky, not the grave, is our goal. Oh, tremble of the angel, oh, voice of the Lord, blessed hope, blessed rest of my soul.
Friends, in this defiant hope in the face of our suffering, before our big and mysterious and loving God, I invite you to stand and sing the song with us.
Is